Um, Imagine, if you will, a pressure cooker.
Oh, yeah. Like a really old, heavy-duty cast iron industrial pressure cooker.
Exactly. You seal the lid. I mean, you really clamp it down. You crank up the heat, and then
Walk away.
you just walk away. You
Yep.
pretend everything is totally fine. And that is essentially the state of Europe between 1815 and 1914.
That is a very evocative image, and honestly, it's kind of the perfect place to start because looking at our sources for today, specifically the excerpts we've pulled from Centuries of Change, you can practically feel that pressure building in the text. It's almost vibrating.
It's palpable. So let's set the scene for this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
The Napoleonic Wars are finally over. Napoleon is exiled, the map is redrawn, and you've got this deeply conservative era, the age of Metternich.
Right.
The old guard, the kings, the queens, the dukes, the people with the fancy titles. They are desperately trying to keep a lid on things. They want peace, they want order, and they definitely want to keep their jobs.
Mm-hmm. They wanted to hit the undo button on history, basically. They wanted to go back to the way things were before 1789. But the problem was you had two massive fires burning underneath that pressure cooker. You can't just wish them away.
No, you really can't.
First, you have the memory of the French Revolution.
Right, because you can't just tell people to forget that they once chopped off a king's head, declared a republic, and demanded human rights. That cat does not go back in the bag.
Exactly. The idea that a monarch isn't divine, that the people actually have power, that idea is out there now. And the second fire is the Industrial Revolution. It's completely upending how people live, work, and die. It's changing the physical landscape of the continent.
So you have these old-school monarchs trying to rule a world that is rapidly becoming modern and industrial.
Precisely. So today, we aren't just looking at a timeline of dates. We are looking at the steam escaping that cooker. We're asking the big question. How on earth did society move from absolute monarchs and divine right to the messy, modern political landscape we recognize today?
It definitely wasn't a straight line.
Not even close. It was a brawl. We're going to unpack 4 distinct isms that emerged from this chaos to challenge the status quo: liberalism, radicalism, socialism, and anarchism.
And before you tune out, because those sound like, dusty chapters in a high school textbook, the stakes here were life and death.
Absolutely.
These weren't just guys in powdered wigs arguing in a salon. They were fighting over the definition of freedom, over who gets to vote, who gets to eat, and who actually owns the wealth in a society.
These ideas dismantle the conservative consensus. They are the blueprints for the modern world. If you want to understand why our politics look the way they do right now, you have to understand these 4 arguments.
So let's crack this open. The first big challenger to the crown, and probably the one that sounds most familiar to us, liberalism.
Right. Now, we need to put a massive warning label on this term right up front. When we say liberalism in the 19th century European context, we are not talking about modern American politics. We aren't talking about the left in the way we think of it now.
This is actually closer to what we might call libertarianism or classical liberalism today, right? The limited government crowd.
Precisely. Their keywords were individual rights, constitution, and free markets. They were the direct descendants of the Enlightenment. And their core innovation was the concept of popular sovereignty.
Which is a fancy way of saying the king isn't in charge because God said so. He's only in charge because we, the people, allow it.
Yes. It transfers the source of power from the sky to the people, or at least to the Constitution. And alongside that political shift, they had a very specific economic worldview: enlightened self-interest.
Meaning, if you let individuals act for themselves, make their own money, make their own choices, pursue their own business interests without the government interfering, it actually benefits society as a whole.
It's Adam Smith. It's the invisible hand.
Right. But what makes the source text fascinating is seeing how they tried to turn that philosophy into a hard science. Take Jeremy Bentham, for instance. He brings in this idea of utilitarianism.
Bentham is such a fascinating character. He basically tried to create a mathematical formula for morality. He wanted to quantify good.
He was looking at the legal system and saying, this is a mess of tradition and superstition. He proposed that actions shouldn't be judged by tradition or the Bible or what the king wants. They should be judged by their utility.
And the formula was deceptively simple. The question is, does this action increase pleasure and decrease pain? If yes, it's good. If no, it's bad. The goal is the greatest happiness. for the greatest number.
Which sounds incredibly dry. I think he called it the hedonistic calculus. But when you think about it, it's radically secular. He's replacing religious morality with a practical, almost bureaucratic metric. It's moral accounting.
It is moral accounting. He really believed you could score legislation. Like, this law creates 50 points of happiness but 20 points of pain. Pass it. But that accounting approach can get a little cold. It lacks humanity. It treats people as variables.
Yeah.
That's why I have to look at his disciple, John Stuart Mill.
Mill is arguably the heavyweight champion of this era of liberalism. He took Bentham's utility and softened the edges.
Without a doubt. He argued you can't just measure happiness like beans in a jar. You have to look at the quality of happiness and, most importantly, the liberty of the individual to pursue it.
And this is where Mill drops a bombshell that was way, way ahead of his time. We have to talk about the subjection of women.
This is pivotal. Here you have this prominent male philosopher in the Victorian era, a time when women were legally the property of their fathers or husbands, basically saying, hey, we are hypocrites.
He called out the entire liberal movement.
He did. He argued that you cannot claim to support liberty or individual rights while keeping half the human race in legal bondage. He wrote that the legal subordination of women was wrong in itself, and one of the chief hindrances to human improvement.
He wasn't just saying be nice to women. He was arguing for equal suffrage and property rights.
He provided a philosophical defense for representative government that included everyone, not just the guys in the smoking room. It was a huge pivot. But liberalism wasn't just about voting or philosophy. It was also about money.
Right. We have to talk about the Anti-Corn Law League. I feel like every history student glosses over this because corn law sounds like the most boring topic imaginable. But This was actually a vicious class war.
It really was. To understand it, you have to know that corn here basically means grain wheat, breadstuff. Britain had these strict protectionist tariffs on imported grain. This kept the price of bread artificially high.
Now, who benefits from high bread prices? The people who grow the wheat, the rich aristocrats with massive estates. High prices meant high rents.
But if you were a factory worker in Manchester making pennies a day,
you're starving. High bread prices were devastating for the urban poor.
Exactly. So the Anti-Corn Law League was the liberal middle class mobilizing against the aristocracy. They were saying, your greed is literally starving the nation. They held rallies, they printed pamphlets. It was a modern political campaign.
It's the free market versus the old feudal landlords.
And the liberals won. They got the tariffs repealed in 1846. It was a massive symbolic victory because it proved that the economic dominance of the old landowning class could be broken. It signaled that the future belonged to the merchants and the industrialists, not the dukes.
And there's always a massive, but in history, liberalism had a blind spot, a big one. And that leads us to our next ism. Because for all this talk of the people and liberty, the early liberals were often pretty picky about which people got to participate.
That's the crucial conflict. Many early liberals were elites themselves. They wanted a constitution to check the king, sure, but they were terrified of the mob. They didn't want the uneducated masses running the country. They favored property-based voting requirements.
So you can vote, but only if you own a house or only if you pay this much in taxes.
Exactly. If you didn't own land or have a certain amount of wealth, you didn't get a voice. You were just labor. You were a cog in the machine.
Enter the radicals.
The radicals looked at the liberals and said, you're not going far enough. You're just replacing one elite with another. They demanded thorough democratization.
Their big checklist. Universal male suffrage. No property requirements. If you're a breeding male citizen, you vote.
And full citizenship, regardless of your social title. They wanted to completely erase the distinction between a duke and a dock worker when it came to rights. They wanted a meritocracy, but a real one.
The standout group here has to be the Chartists in Britain. This is such a classic underdog story.
The Chartists were a working class movement. They emerged specifically because the Reform Bill of 1832, which was a big liberal victory, completely stiffed the working man. It gave the vote to the middle-class shopkeepers, but left the factory workers with nothing.
So they wrote up the People's Charter, hence Chartists, and they were asking for 6 points, right? Universal male suffrage, secret ballots so your boss couldn't see who you voted for, and payment for members of parliament.
That last one is so interesting because if MPs aren't paid, then only rich people can afford to sit in parliament. If you want a worker to represent workers, you have to pay him a salary so he doesn't starve while he's serving. It was about opening up the system entirely.
They gathered millions of signatures. They held massive, rain-soaked rallies on the moors.
It was a huge movement, but the narrative arc here is tragic. In the moment, they failed. Parliament basically laughed at them, they rejected the petitions, the government arrested their leaders and waited for the rain to wash the movement away. By 1848, it had fizzled out.
But if you look at the long game,
Almost every single one of their demands was eventually adopted. We have secret ballots, we have paid representatives, we have universal suffrage. They lost the battle, but they won the war. They shifted the window of what was politically possible.
and speaking of shifting windows, we have to shine a spotlight on Flora Tristan. We mentioned Mill supporting women's rights, but Tristan takes it to a different level. She was a French activist operating in the mid-1800s.
Flora Tristan is a powerhouse. She made a connection that a lot of the male radicals completely missed. She linked the worker and the woman. She famously called the working woman the proletarian of the proletariat.
The lowest of the low, the servant of the servant.
Exactly. She argued that the rights of the working class and the rights of women were inextricably linked. She basically said to the male workers, you guys want to be free. You can't be free if half the population, your wives and daughters, are still in chains.
She traveled all around France preaching this message of absolute equality. She laid the groundwork for the socialist feminism that would come later.
She really did.
So let's pause and reset the board here. We've got liberals wanting free markets and limited government. We've got radicals screaming for the vote. But meanwhile, the industrial engine is still churning. And for the average person, voting doesn't put dinner on the table.
That is the key friction point. Industrialization created immense wealth, more than Europe had ever seen. But it was concentrated in the hands of a very few. The majority lived in squalor that is hard for us to imagine today. Open sewers, 14-hour workdays, children as young as 6 losing fingers in loom machines.
This is where socialism steps onto the stage. And the core argument here isn't about voting rights. It's about the means of production.
Right. Factories, land, resources. The source texts show socialists arguing that these shouldn't be owned by private individuals who profit from others' labor. They should be owned by the community. They looked at the liberal idea of individual liberty and said, what good is the liberty to starve?
But looking closely at the text, you see a massive split within socialism itself. It wasn't one big happy family.
No, it was split between what we call the utopian socialists and the scientific socialists.
Let's start with the utopians. These are the guys I kind of want to hang out with. They were the dreamers.
They were optimists. They believed they could reorganize society into cooperative communities to end exploitation peacefully. They thought if they just showed the world a better way to live, everyone, even the rich, would agree and join in.
Henri de Saint-Simon is a great example. He had this idea that society was upside down.
Yes, Saint-Simon said society should be led by the doers, the industrialists, the engineers, the scientists, and the workers. He wanted to get rid of the parasites, the court aristocracy, and the church hierarchy who didn't produce anything but sucked up all the wealth. It was a very technocratic vision.
And then you have Robert Owen. He didn't just write about it. He actually put his money where his mouth was. He built New Lanark in Scotland.
A fascinating experiment. Owen was a wealthy mill owner himself, but he was appalled by the conditions in other factories, so he turned his factory town into a prototype utopia.
He introduced 8-hour workdays when 14 was the norm. He banned child labor under the age of 10 and provided free education for them instead, which was unheard of.
He built decent housing with sanitation. He stocked the company store with good food at fair prices.
Other factory owners must have thought he was insane. You're educating the workforce. You're giving them time off. You'll go bankrupt.
And the crazy thing is, it worked. It was profitable. It was clean. It was literally a tourist attraction. But here is the tragedy of utopian socialism. The model didn't spread. It remained an island. Owen pleaded with other leaders to follow his lead, but they ignored him because exploitation was cheaper.
And that failure of the nice approach is exactly what triggered the second branch of socialism.
The scientific socialists, or as we know them, the Marxists.
Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They enter the chat, look at Robert Owen, and basically say, that's cute, but it's naive.
They were scathing. They weren't interested in building a nice little village in Scotland. They were looking at the gears of history. In the Communist Manifesto, they laid out a theory that history isn't random. It's governed by laws, specifically the laws of class struggle.
So for them, it's not about convincing the rich to be nice.
No, they argued history has always been about the oppressor and the oppressed. Master and slave, lord and serf. And in their time, they saw it as the bourgeoisie, the owners, versus the proletariat, the workers.
And unlike the utopians who hoped for cooperation, Marx and Engels predicted conflict.
They predicted that revolution was inevitable, not just possible, inevitable. They believed the system of capitalism was inherently unstable. They thought the workers would eventually realize they were being exploited, develop class consciousness, and rise up in a cataclysmic revolution to overthrow the bourgeoisie.
It's a much more aggressive, deterministic view of the world. It's almost religious in its certainty. The revolution is coming.
It is. It provided a master narrative. And this inspired figures like Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg later on. These women didn't just read the books, they organized. Zetkin in Germany, Luxemburg in Poland and Germany, they took these theoretical ideas and used them to challenge the most powerful empires in Europe. They proved that Marxism wasn't just a book on a shelf, it was a movement.
So we've gone from let's vote with the radicals to let's share with the utopians to let's revolt with the Marxists. But there is one more stop on this train, and it is the end of the line, the total rejection of everything, anarchism.
Anarchism is the most radical end of the spectrum. The other ideologies we discussed wanted to change who ran the government or how the government worked. Even Marx wanted a dictatorship of the proletariat to manage the transition. Anarchism said no, the government is the problem.
Burn it all down.
Essentially, they asserted that all forms of government authority were unnecessary and inherently oppressive. They wanted a society of voluntary cooperation. No state, no police, no borders, just people living together.
And the poster boy for this is Mikhail Bakunin, a Russian revolutionary with a massive beard and a massive personality.
He famously clashed with Marx. Bakunin argued that if you use a state to create socialism like Marx wanted, you'll just end up with a new tyranny. You'll just replace the czar with a committee.
He was surprisingly prophetic on that point, looking at the Soviet Union later.
He really was. Bakunin advocated for the creative passion for destruction. He wanted secret societies and violent uprisings to destroy the state apparatus immediately. He believed you had to clear the rubble of the old world before you could build anything new.
But obviously, destroy everything is a hard pitch for a functioning society. That's where Georges Sorel comes in with a slightly more organized version of this chaos.
Right. Sorel gives us syndicalism. This addresses the practical question. Okay, we burn the government down, the king is gone, the police are gone. Who manages the sewage plant? Who runs the trains?
A very practical question.
Sorel argued that once the state is gone, property and power should transfer to labor unions or syndicates in French.
So the union hall becomes the government house.
In a way. He believed in the power of the disral strike, the idea that if all workers just stopped working at once, arms folded, the capitalist system would collapse and the unions would take over administration of the economy. It wasn't just do whatever you want, it was power-centered in organized labor.
It's amazing to see the spectrum here. From let's have a constitution with the liberals to let's have labor unions run the world with the syndicalists.
And that's the key synthesis here. When you step back and look at the big picture, these four ideologies, liberalism, radicalism, socialism, anarchism, they completely dismantled the conservative consensus established after Napoleon.
The pressure cooker we talked about at the beginning, they didn't just let off steam, they blew the lid off.
Completely. They challenged the legitimacy of the state. They questioned the morality of capitalism. They fought over who gets to participate in politics. They reshaped the entire European debate. The Europe of 1914 was fundamentally different from the Europe of 1815 because of these ideas.
And really, if you look at the 20th century, and even today, aren't we still having these fights?
Absolutely. The political debates of the modern world are essentially just remixes of the fights between these four schools of thought. We are still arguing about individual rights versus community welfare. We are still arguing about the role of the state in the economy. We are still arguing about wealth distribution. We are still arguing about who gets to vote and how. It all started here.
It really puts the culture war into perspective. We're just dancing to the tune they wrote 150 years ago.
We are living in the world they imagined.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you to chew on. We looked at 4 fixes for the problems of industrial society. Liberalism focused on the individual and the market. Socialism focused on the community and equality. Anarchism focused on the absence of authority. Radicalism focused on the equality of the vote.
Right.
Looking around at the world today, at our economy, our politics, and our social structures, which one of these 19th century ideas has actually aged the best? Which one offered the most accurate diagnosis of the modern condition?
That is a question worth pondering.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.